京都大学を卒業しました。残念ながら日本語はほとんど忘れてしまいました。So I'm going to continue in Eigo, in English, if that's okay. Everybody can hear me, right? Okay, excellent. Let's jump straight into the presentation. I'm actually going to turn my video off just in case there's feedback. Okay, great. So thanks everybody for joining. And my name is Arjun Hazard. I'm working on product development at, sorry, there's a bit of background noise. Okay, I think it's fine. Yeah, so I work on product development at NuCypher. And just to introduce the NuCypher project, we develop privacy-focused, cryptography-driven open source tech. But more specifically, we combine breakthrough in cryptography, so threshold proxy re-encryption, which is the main one, which I'll go into in detail, with some new decentralization paradigms. So things like distributed computing, crypto economics, and we take this combination and offer a privacy layer to developers of decentralized applications and systems. That's quite complicated, so I'm going to summarize what NuCypher does as practical privacy, which is the name of this talk. And I hope that by the end, you'll understand what that means, how our technology works, and why we believe that it's an important component of the next internet. Okay, so let's go into practical privacy. It's bringing together two things. So ordinary, everyday technological capabilities with the preservation and protection of user privacy. So by ordinary capabilities, I mean useful workflows and actions that most developers would want to have in their application or platform. So actually, you could also describe it as things that, or features that users generally take for granted. So for example, we want to transfer data from user A to user B, but we want to do it without user A being online at the moment that data is shared. It's things like efficient many-to-many communication. So for example, large group chats like Telegram. It's also granting read permissions in a scalable manner. So for example, mimicking the capabilities of a centralized access control system. So for an example of that would be AWS's key management system, or KMS, or Google Cloud has a similar one. It's also querying data, comparing a single data point to a wider set, and then also a little bit more advanced, but training models and algorithms, and then using those models to predict something. Okay, so all of that is generally present in most successful digital applications, most large-scale platforms. And as I said, end users take these kind of capabilities for granted. In fact, most developers outside of the blockchain world also take these features for granted. So it's not special to provide features like this. It just fulfills the expectations of users. Okay, it becomes special if you also preserve user privacy in a robust way while providing these capabilities. So what do I mean by preserving privacy? For the purpose of like this talk and NuCypher technology, it means preserving the encrypted state of the data while we attempt to do the actions I just mentioned. So we're talking about maintaining the encrypted state while the data is at rest, in flight, and in some cases, you can keep it encrypted while it's in use. Another way to describe the privacy preservation from NuCypher's point of view is that we're looking to avoid unnecessary decryption events. I think at this moment, since this is really important to the high-level idea of what NuCypher is trying to do, I might stop and allow some translation and also some questions if there are any. Yeah, if you would like to translate any of this.
I just want to, so I guess the notification from your side.
Do you want me to continue?
Yeah, but for starting new, after notification of that, I heard
Okay, okay, no problem. Okay, so yeah, I'll just continue with this slide. So just very briefly, it's important as a developer of a decentralized application that's leveraging NuCypher or leveraging any kind of privacy tool, just to think about why privacy matters. Privacy is not a binary concept. It's not always relevant. But some examples of why privacy might be an important component of your stack or a privacy tool. For example, you might want to ensure user safety. So you want to protect end users from harm on account of data associated with them. So for example, a journalist might be reporting in an authoritarian regime, and it's very important if he or she is using an end-to-end encrypted data sharing tool that it is highly secure. Secondly, you might want to prevent things like identity fraud. So these are crimes related to personal information, like credit card numbers or social security numbers. The third one, citizens, as we know, can be hacked by corporations and governments who harvest personal data and then use that to influence them. This is another reason why you might want to protect user privacy. The fourth one, this one's actually relevant to a use case I'll go into later. So privacy preservation can preserve the value of data, personal data in particular, such that it can be sold. So actually, this is also relevant to company intellectual property and things like competitive advantage. But generally, if something is leaked and becomes public, sometimes it loses its value. And I'll explain what I mean by this in more detail later. And then finally, yeah, you have to follow certain legal requirements and regulation. So things like GDPR. There are duties that data custodians have to follow. And generally in the world, they're becoming more stringent. They're becoming more tough. So in California, they passed a bill which would see them align with the European Union on individual privacy. And I think that's the trend, is that we're moving towards a more privacy conscious world from a legal point of view. Okay, great. So our primary offering, the one that is closest to launching, is best described as decentralized access control. And generally, this is a way to manage permissions associated with a given set of data or a secret or a message. And as I mentioned, we achieve this by bringing together two things: cryptography, like threshold proxy re-encryption, which is on the slide, and decentralization paradigms. And we're going to go into threshold proxy re-encryption in most detail. But before I get into NuCypher technology, we should answer an important question, which you might be already thinking, which is, what exactly is the issue or the problem with using traditional approaches to public key encryption or asymmetric encryption when you're building a decentralized application? And it's a very important question to answer. Okay, I'm going to explain that. So let's say we have a data owner or a data controller called Alice, and they have some encrypted data, which is M. We want to send M to a recipient, and we want to make sure they can decrypt the data and see the data. So first, what we do is we take the encrypted M and we decrypt it. And then we take the designated recipient's public key and we create a new ciphertext for them. Actually, as you can see, we normally apply this process to a symmetric key that's associated with the underlying data. But anyway, we can repeat that process if we want to for Charlie, another recipient, and basically for any unlimited number of recipients. So that's all fine. This is all like entry-level public key cryptography. But what matters from the point of view of privacy and scalability is where this decryption and encryption events occur. If they occur in Alice's client on her device, then we can assume that her privacy is maintained, is preserved. But there are some performance limitations here. So first, Alice has to be online. And also, it doesn't scale well for many messages to many recipients because you're decrypting and creating new ciphertext for every single message on the user's device. So try to imagine, if you will, a Facebook where for you to see the timeline or the profile of somebody else, they would have to be online if there'd been some new data created by them. It wouldn't be very good for stalking if they had to be online for you to see them. Or another example where the scalability might not work, or this approach might not work, is imagine if you were getting a car on Uber and it was very difficult for the driver to share their live location with you because of the computational overhead of re-encrypting the location again and again on the driver's mobile device. So the way I would summarize this particular way of doing things, where it's all happening in the data owner's client, is that it's okay, it's adequate, if all your users need is one-to-one, irregular, conveniently timed sharing. So imagine you just want to share once a year some data with your accountant or something, then this approach is fine. But of course, we know that most mainstream applications don't use this approach. They instead, this flow occurs not in Alice's client, but on a centralized remote server managed by a Facebook or a Google or Dropbox or whoever. And this is very scalable. But conversely, now there are privacy concerns. The concentration, well, what happens here is, as we've just seen, is that the data is decrypted. So there is a plain text state of the data in order for it to be shared with these recipients. And that is a concentration of vulnerable data, which we might describe as a honeypot of value, which makes it a lot easier for a hacker or for a state actor to try and access it. And it's also worth just mentioning that the employees of the firm that manage these kind of remote servers and oversee the server-side decryption are not infallible either. And a good example of that is late last year, there were some reports about Saudi Arabia grooming a Twitter employee to spy on the accounts of suspected dissidents. So they wanted to find the IP address and some private messages from the Twitter accounts. And they tried to do that through a Twitter employee. So basically, if you use a remote server for your access control, it really compromises your attempt to build a trustless or a trust minimizing system. Okay, here's the last scenario for this process. What if your data is stored in decentralized storage? That's the new world we're going into, where your data is in IPFS or in Swarm or in Storage, Storage, the other blockchain project. What that means is that the data is going to be across, living across thousands of untrusted anonymous machines all around the world. So this decryption and ciphertext creation as a necessary step to share data between users becomes very dangerous. So instead of worrying that there's an adversary attempting to breach the endpoint security of a big data center, now you could share a sensitive document with a colleague and see it decrypted on the machine that belongs to the adversary. So it's no longer adversaries trying to get into the system. They could be the ones who actually are managing the data. So generally, you can say that doing centralized style access control with decentralized storage is very dangerous. And so for decentralized storage, you need decentralized access control. In fact, you need decentralized access control for the decentralized internet. That's our main argument. Okay, everyone good so far? I've basically explained the problems of not using NuCypher. So now I'm going to start explaining how NuCypher works and why it solves some of these problems. Are there any questions at this point, or any thing that needs to be translated? Minna daijoubu desu ka? I'm going to take that as a yes. Okay, so let's go into the cryptography and explain some of these concepts behind NuCypher. So I'm going to show an animation now, which is going to explain how proxy re-encryption works. Okay, so it begins like many other approaches to secure data management. Alice, the data owner, is encrypting the sensitive data with her public key and sending it to live in storage somewhere. Okay, so now Alice wants to share this data with a designated recipient, Bob, just like before. If Bob were right now to attempt to gain access using his private key to this ciphertext, he wouldn't be able to decrypt it, and therefore he wouldn't be able to see the underlying data. So in order to get him access, the application that Alice is using generates a special kind of key known as a re-encryption key. And this is constructed using her private key and Bob's public key. And at no point is her private key exposed to anyone, and it stays on her device, her private key. That's important. So next, the re-encryption key is sent to a proxy. The proxy's role is to transform Alice's ciphertext using the re-encryption key into a form decryptable by the recipient. The proxy is this anonymous machine third party somewhere else in the world. And he or she does rewards and for fees. What emerges is a new ciphertext made especially for Bob and only for Bob. And Bob's private key is now able to decrypt the ciphertext. And he can use the result of that decryption to access the original data that Alice intended him to see. Okay, cool. So this actually is a form of asymmetric encryption, public key encryption, just like the one I described earlier and described the problems of. But it has some very important benefits. One is that because there's a network, because there are proxies, there's instead of it's not happening in the client, it's happening on the proxy's machine. There's always a proxy available in the network to do the access, manage the permissions and grant access. It doesn't matter if Alice is online or not. Also, you can prescribe conditions based on which the proxy will grant or revoke access to Bob. So for example, you could say, only re-encrypt for Bob if he pays me, and then they can enforce that. And then here's the really important thing. Unlike with traditional access management systems, Alice's data was encrypted from the moment it left her device all the way until it came to Bob. So she doesn't have to trust a central authority like a remote server. She didn't have to trust the proxy. The proxy could not access the raw data, the plain text data, and she doesn't have to trust NuCypher because we are not really involved in this. Okay, cool. That is proxy re-encryption in a nutshell. So you now all are experts in proxy re-encryption, which is great. Okay, and you might have noticed though that in the last animation that although the proxy cannot access the plain text, the underlying data, it is still reliant on a third party to perform a service, right? So you could have a DOS attack here where the proxy just refuses to re-encrypt and says, you know what, I'm not going to use the re-encryption key to transform the ciphertext. And Bob, I'm not going to be able to see the data, the sensitive data, but Bob, you're not going to get it either. So this is where we brought in the second part, decentralization. And I've got another animation to explain that. So in a true NuCypher workflow, the re-encryption key I described earlier is actually split into a set of fragments. And each fragment is sent to a different proxy. Here we have 5 proxies. And each of them produces a ciphertext fragment. And then a smaller number of those fragments can be recombined to produce the ciphertext for Bob. So what we've done here, I might actually just play that again because it's kind of a little fast. So what we've done here is avoid relying on a single proxy, which brings greater redundancy, security, and prevents or resists censorship. I just want to emphasize again that even without this decentralization split key mechanism, the proxies only handle re-encryption keys and ciphertext, which do not get them anywhere near the underlying plain text. But now they only are given a fragment of a key to work with. So even if they misbehave, it doesn't make any difference because the other proxies will perform the service and the data will reach its destination. This is the power of the network. So if a proxy is malicious or corruptible or hackable or incompetent, it doesn't matter. So what we basically have here is the means of getting data from A to B with the scalability and performance of a centralized service, but with the trustlessness of public key cryptography, the first or the client side re-encryption that we discussed at the beginning. Okay, I'm going to now show a quick demo, unless, again, please feel free to jump in with any questions or take a break to discuss or have some things translated. Okay, I'll continue. Based on the silence, I will continue.
We got some questions. We got a question that in the with the ciphertext, the wire from the encryption.
Sorry, it's really hard to hear you. Apologies.
I was just typing in the exact confirm. So in the with the ciphertext, you can acquire from the encryption key. Is that able to be on the network?
So I think what we should do is, if you don't mind, I have the Slack open. Perhaps you could write the question there, because I can't. It's very difficult for me to hear. You guys. But that's okay. I can answer that question once I see it. I'll quickly just go into the demo, and then I'll stop to answer questions. So, can everybody see my screen? I'll just make this bigger. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spin up a node, a proxy, onto my machine. And then we're going to use that so that I've launched a node on my machine. I'm going to use this. We're going to use this node to go through a demo, or actually run an application which will share data from a owner to a recipient via the proxy that's also local on my machine. Okay, so just quickly, I've launched the, if you can see, I'm trying to make it bigger. I've launched the proxy here, and it's running a script that tells me that it's telling me that the node can't find any other nodes, because normally when you launch the network, the nodes or proxies are going to talk to each other. So right now it's saying it cannot learn, it can't find other nodes. So, watashi no proxy wa choto sabishi ne. It's basically alone, and it's trying to learn from other proxies, but it can't. But that's okay, we don't need it to do that for this demo. So now I'll just launch the application up here on this one. It'll just take a second. Cool, okay, we have the application. No, it's still thinking about it. It's connecting to my, okay, it's connected to my node, that's great. I'm gonna just go to this address. Okay, so this is an application that demonstrates some of the capabilities of NuCypher. In general, what the application is doing is a data owner called Tia. She wants to share data from a heart monitor, so a device, with a doctor. And it's going to involve the NuCypher network, but actually in reality, the NuCypher network is being represented by a single proxy on my machine. And so I think Alice, Alicia, and Bob are easy to understand. Alice is the data owner and Bob is the designated recipient. I haven't explained anything about Enrico or the heart monitor. The heart monitor is called Enrico. I'll get to that character in a second, but in general, Enrico is there to encrypt data and write it to her sharing policy on Alicia's behalf. So for Alice, for Alicia. So let's start by going into Alicia's screen. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a policy key. So this is a unique key associated with a sharing policy. And now we're going to go to Enrico. This is the heart monitor. And we're going to give Enrico this policy key. So Enrico is now, or the heart monitor is now aware that there is a policy. And now what Alicia is going to do is she's going to turn on her heart monitor. And it's going to start measuring her heart rate. Okay, so this is like random data, but you could apply this to a real heart monitor that's producing real heart data. So you can see here that this is the sort of live data coming out of the heart monitor. But more importantly, you can see that here that Enrico, because they are encrypting it, or the character is encrypting it, and it is also being written to the policy. So Enrico has a write access, but once the data has been written, they don't have a read access. So if there's other data on that policy, Enrico and the heart monitor cannot see it. Okay, cool. Let's go back to Alice for now. Now she's going to create, or she's going to grant access to the policy to the doctor. So the policy exists, but we need to add a recipient to that policy. Oh, actually, we need to go get Bob's key first. So, okay, Dr. Bob. Dr. Bob needs a public key, otherwise we can't share with him. So we're going to generate a key pair, and this is the public key from the private key public key pair. And then we're going to go back to Alice, and we're going to put in his public key here. We'll set the policy duration to 5 days. Don't worry about this. This actually means how many proxies are going to be involved, and obviously we only have one proxy, which I'm running, so we only can use one. Okay, we grant access. Access has been granted. You can see this, by the way, that. Oh, I should have mentioned before. Sorry. What's cool is you can see that the data that's being encrypted and shared is actually you can see it's
Sorry, Adam, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you make the white screen a bit more larger so we can see the... Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
That's good.
Can you make the terminal a bit more larger?
Which one?
The terminal, the dark one.
The dark one.
Yeah. And I left some questions we got from the participants. So
sounds good. I will answer those. I'll just finish because I'm nearly done with this, and I'll answer. Okay, so I just wanted to point out. Sorry. Hopefully everything is relatively clear. But I want to point out that in the application terminal, you can see that the heart rate, encrypted heart rates are being generated. But right now the node is not seeing anything because we haven't actually done anything that involves the proxies yet. We've just been generating data, but we haven't shared it. And it's only when we share it that it involves the proxies. Okay, so So we've granted access. We go back to Bob. Now here's a really important thing. We have granted access to Bob, but Bob has not requested access yet. This is really important because Alice has shared the data, but she can now go offline. I'll just quit her for dramatic effect. And now we can wait. Let's imagine that 3 days go by of just this heart rate monitor is generating data, and it's been 3 days. And now Dr. Bob, who's kind of lazy, is going to say, actually, I'm going to go and check Alice's data. Maybe she's, she has a bad heart, but Dr. Bob doesn't, he waits a little bit of time before he goes and checks it. So now when I click read, I'm going to actually issue an access request to the proxy, to my proxy, and the proxy should grant me Dr. Bob access. As you can see, I clicked read heartbeats, and now the proxy in the bottom right corner is re-encrypting each data point for me, Dr. Bob. And you can see that I'm getting the plain text data out here as an output, which corresponds to the data that the heart rate monitor is generating. Although here it's encrypted. You can see, okay, 62, 60, 61. You can see like 62, 60, 61 here. And it's going via the proxy on my machine, which I think is super cool. That's not the easiest demo to follow, especially not remotely. So don't worry if it's not completely clear. I'm going to spend more time on that because the task that we set relates closely to this demo. So don't worry if it's not all totally clear. I'll put this here so you can have a look at the broad overview. Now let me have a look at these questions. Yes, okay, so if I've understood question 1 correctly, which is in regards to the ciphertext you acquired from the re-encryption key, is that able to be on a public network? I'm interpreting that question as, can it be shared, like, can it be open to anyone? And the answer is generally yes, because the only person who can decrypt that ciphertext is Bob, because only his private key decrypts it. It has been transformed with his public key and with the re-encryption key. Well, initially with his public key and which is part of the re-encryption key construction. So that only he can decrypt it. So yes, I think in principle it can be a public and like an object, but I will just reserve a little bit of hesitation there in case there is some security problem which I'm not aware of. So the second question.
We got some additional questions.
Mm-hmm.
Can you provide us a reason why we are using view proxy?
Why are we using the proxy?
I mean, couples, not single one.
Oh, multiple proxies.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So that I go back to a slide I had earlier. I think this is the last one, so I understand it's not super clear. Okay, I don't know. Okay, cool. Right. So I showed in this animation, which I'll show again in a second, but first I'll try to explain. So what happens in a, when NuCypher launches its network is that when Alice, the data owner, create a re-encryption key, it's actually, you create multiple fragments of key, so pieces or a split key. And those keys are going out to lots of proxies and held onto by those proxies so that they can perform the re-encryption when they need to. Now, the reason that there's a few reasons why this is useful actually, but the main reason is that in order to create the ciphertext on the other end for Bob to get the data, let's say you sent the re-encryption keys to 20 proxies. You can configure it, you can set it so that only 10 of them need to do a re-encryption for Bob to get the data. So this is what we call an M of N scheme. And it uses a form of Shamir secret sharing to achieve this, where you say, okay, 10 of 20 need to do their job such that, so that Bob can get the transformed ciphertext and access the underlying data. So what that means is if, let's say, 2 proxies go offline, and 2 proxies decide that they're going to refuse to do the job, it doesn't matter because there's still 16 more that can do the job, and we only needed 10. So it's about redundancy and it's about security, and generally just making sure that the end-to-end re-encryption times are very short, because there's sort of like an oversupply of proxies for every single re-encryption job. Does that make sense?
聞いたのは、例えば20の星に、最悪を分化したときに、例えば、そのうち20のうちの2つが、タスクというか、複合の、タスクを、拒否したりだとか、2つが、20のうちの2つがタスクをやらない、その複合のタスクをやらないっていうところで、例えば条件として10の、プロキシだけ、稼働すれば OK っていう条件であれば、20のうち、なんていうんですかね、20のうちの10動いていれば、ちゃんと稼働するように。
Just to like highlight this point. So you can see here that the number of key splits we sent is 5, right? Okay, and then, so n equals 5. And then they go into the proxies, and actually only 4 of them do the job. See this blue one? This blue one didn't do it. This is a Namakemono proxy. Lazy proxy didn't do the job. So we only have 4 came out. But it doesn't matter because we set it to be 3. We only need 3 for the ciphertext to be recombined into the transformed ciphertext for Bob. So we didn't even need this 4th one, but luckily it doesn't matter if only 4 out of 5 did the work.
So question. We got some additional question.
Sure.
So the bot is the only one who can decrypt the data, right? So
Yes.
in that point, what is the reason using a proxy?
Okay, so as I discussed in this part of the presentation, you can theoretically share data from Alice to Bob just using her client, right? But also, as we discussed, this doesn't scale well. It's not easy to, she has to be online, and it's costly from an encryption overhead point of view to encrypt for many, many recipients in the set, in the client to do for Bob and Charlie and etc. and Sho and Kage and all the possible recipients. It doesn't work from if you have a large scale application with many users and many edges between those users. So what the proxies are there for is to provide the performance of a large scale access management system or key management system, but without having to trust the key management system.
Okay. So proxy doesn't mean the node on the blockchain. But what's the definition of the proxy? Can you?
Yeah, sorry. That in context of NuCypher, a proxy is a node in the NuCypher network. They are the same thing. Sorry, I used those two words interchangeably, but what you have is a network of. Sorry?
So it means proxy. Proxy means nodes on the.
That's right. Yes. That's correct.
Is this on Ethereum? What's the base? What's the base of this blockchain?
Yes, we are built on Ethereum, but it's important to state that any application, whether they're built on Ethereum or not, can use the NuCypher network, because the NuCypher network is just ingesting key strings and ciphertext strings. And so in theory, you could be a decentralized application built on EOS or whoever, and you could leverage the network of proxies or network of nodes. The only real restriction is that currently our proxies, our nodes, are paid in ETH. So you would need some way of paying them with ETH. But other than that, there isn't too much of a restriction to a single network. I can answer the second question there, which is, re-encryption has been experimented for a few years, but can you give us a few practical use cases of re-encryption? I certainly can, but that actually will be another part of my presentation, which is quite a detailed use case. So maybe before I do that, we can answer more questions or do more explanations related to the demo or to the presentations so far.
Another question. In regard with the distribution of the encryption key, so how actually enhancing the security? Can you repeat those points once more?
In regards to the distributed proxies, what was the question?
So it's it's decentralizing the
Yes.
encryption with your proxy, right? And you're saying that it's enhancing the security, but how actually it's enhancing the security?
That's a really good question. That's an excellent question. So we are currently, we have something called a federated testnet where it's not that decentralized. We do have independent third parties running proxies on their machine, like one laptop right now, but they are mostly, they're independent from us, but they're known entities. Some of the pre-allocated partners that we have that are going to be a reliable set of proxies in our network. However, the goal is, with launch of MIN towards in the spring of this year, that it will be very decentralized, because as I'm sure the audience has noticed, it makes a fairly big difference to the security and the redundancy and other aspects of the service if the proxies that perform the service are actually decentralized and anonymous. It's very, very difficult to shut down, and it's very, very difficult to corrupt or cause problems for this data to be shared. So how are we going to achieve that? Well, a couple of things. One is that we're doing a fair amount of work in studying the miners that are out there already working on existing networks like Ethereum or storage or LivePeer, and looking at their sort of historical activity as miners so that we can attract these reliable but very decentralized miners to run NuCypher proxy nodes on our on behalf of the network. So that's one thing. And then there's sort of a general point that the way that we will allocate, we'll allocate tokens. There's something I should explain first, which is that in order to become a NuCypher proxy, you need to hold a certain amount of NuCypher token, and that token is used as a collateral or a stake. And if you don't re-encrypt, for example, let's say you're that blue proxy that decided not to re-encrypt, then you actually can lose some of your stake. And this is important because basically we will distribute tokens depending on some regulatory considerations, but we will distribute tokens out to a wide range of miners and developers. And then they will be economically tied to the network through the fact that they bought NuCypher tokens. My presentation doesn't talk at all about this, so this is kind of new, but it's a really good question. I guess the main point is that decentralizing the network, and maintaining that decentralization is very, very important to NuCypher.
Okay, let me translate. そうですね。多分質問の意図っていうのはあれですね。各そのプロキシがデータ、断片的にですよ。持ったときにそれが的にどうなのっていうようなこともある。はい。はい。In the with the nodes on the blockchain, is that so is any people on the network can see the data on the, in the proxy? Can anybody can review the data on the proxy of your network?
No, they can't. I think a good example of an instance where something might be written on chain is where you want to. This is not something that we're currently building, but just as an example, if you wanted to issue a challenge to a proxy to sort of prove that they're not doing their job, then there could be an on-chain component where hypothetically you issue like a dummy or kind of like a fake request, and that is recorded on chain. And then when they they don't answer or they re-encrypt incorrectly, you can prove that they should have re-encrypted and they didn't. That's an example of something that might be on chain. But the most important thing is that the sharing process is not happening with there isn't, the data is not published on chain, or the access request is not necessarily published on chain.
今の、プロキシ上でにデータがあって、それがそのネットワーク上の参加者が見えるかということに対しては、見れません。オンチェーンとオフチェーンという概念があるんですけど、そのデータっていうのはオンチェーンで伝えるオフチェーンというところに、乗っけてあって、でオンチェーンには例えばそのデータをちゃんと複合したかどうか、そういう履歴みたいなものを構成というふうに。先ほど、質問があるので、はい。はい。大丈夫ですか。あと、そのインセンティブ設計的なところですね、ちゃんと、動いてない人たちに対しては、ステーキングじゃないですが、ある程度、そのトークンとして、ニューサイファーのトークンみたいなものを持ってないと、そういう、ネットワークに参加できるというような前提条件みたいなことがあって、でちゃんと、やってない人に対しては、懲罰じゃないですか、ステーキングしていたトークンを減らしたりっていうようなインセンティブみたいなものがあるというふうに思いました。Can you proceed with your presentation?
Sure. I have as I said, I describe it as a deep dive case study. So there are actually a lot of different use cases, but I think this one illustrates a few different benefits of using the NuCypher network at the same time. So it's, in that sense, it's a good example. So we understand like how the underlying cryptography works, more or less, and what a proxy does. But now then we've actually seen a demo, but let's take this technology and put it really in the wild into like a real situation. And this case study is based on a framework from a partner of ours, so a real project, a real adopter that is intending to integrate NuCypher into their tech stack. So it's going to take me a second to just explain the context, and then I will explain how NuCypher is involved. So the business case is, I'm going to call it crypto crowdsourcing. So that means using crowds of people to create data. So, data from the real world, like closing time of a shop, or like is there traffic in on Metasando, or any kind of real world data, and contributing it to a common resource, and where the sort of aggregate of the data is very valuable. So here we're saying map data. So for example, data that might be on Google Maps or Yelp or Waze or something like that. And sometimes it's called reality capture, which is kind of a fancy way to describe it. It sounds pretty cool. Okay, so I'm going to be a bit more specific actually, and talk about self-driving cars, because that also sounds exciting. So specifically, if you were driving a self-driving car, how would you know in advance that there's some construction work or some road work that's blocking the road? Now, it turns out that if you use the LiDAR, which is like the detection system on the car, if you only use that to detect the road work, it actually can overload your processor. So there's a whole marketplace and a whole business need for self-driving cars maps built for self-driving cars, where the onboard computer of the car is already knows that there is going to be roadwork or traffic or something, and they don't have to work it out from nothing, from scratch. Okay, so that maps database for self-driving cars has to be very regularly updated, right? Otherwise, it's not useful, because traffic can happen in a short amount of time, or road work can happen in a short amount of time, or whatever. But also, it's very true as well that if you asked one company to try and provide that data, like Google with the Google Streetcar, it would be very difficult. They have to be driving around all the time, and it would be very annoying. Okay, so this is where the crowdsourcing comes in. Instead, we want to ask a lot of drivers to contribute data that they create when they drive around. So this is going to be the best maps database that always has the latest real world data, and it's coming from lots of different people who have cars and have detection on their cars. Everybody okay so far? I'm setting up a big business need here, because it's important to understand the context. Okay, so the problem with this is that who owns the database? Who can see the raw data? Because each driver is sharing their time-stamped coordinate by coordinate movements, very sensitive data, where they are and what's happening where they are. Also, you would think that each driver would want to be paid for doing this. And also, we need to coordinate all these cars driving around. You want one car to drive past roadwork, and then a second one to confirm and validate that. It's very complicated, and it has a lot of privacy issues. Okay, so we have this use case. We're calling it crowdsourcing map data, and we basically have three requirements. We have privacy problems. So there's this real world data collection is building up this very rich database of the collectors, where the collectors are going. And also, there's also a privacy question here, where we say, well, we don't want the data to leak, because if you are a driver contributing to this database, if it leaks and somebody can get your data, then you will not be paid for it. So remember, really, at the beginning of the presentation, I talked about one of the reasons you might want to ensure or preserve the privacy of your users is because then they can monetize it. This is a good example. If I'm driving around and my privacy of my data is not being protected, and someone else can just access it, then why would they pay for it? Okay, next we have data availability. As I said, it needs to be regularly updated to reflect the continuously changing physical world. And you need to aggregate the data of one driver with the data of another driver. It's not useful for one person to just provide data. They can't cover sufficient ground. So if you were to use like basic public key encryption here, you'd have to wait for each contributor to come online and approve access. And until everybody had responded, then you would have an incomplete data set. So for example, if you had a group of drivers trying to tell the map about a traffic accident, which is going to be, changing every second, then you really need it to be shared, even if whether or not they are offline or online. And then finally, I won't go into detail on this, but basically you want to make sure that the data collectors are being paid. And you also want to be able to remove access to the data if they're not paying. So for example, if the map stops paying, then they should not have access to the data that the driver is making. Okay, sorry, that was a very long introduction, but now we can explain why NuCypher is relevant to this. So all of these issues can kind of simultaneously be addressed by decentralized access control and the NuCypher network. Okay, let's go through the flow. First thing that's going to happen is that the maps application engages with the collector network by issuing them an offer and some specifications for them to collect data. Okay, this is an important step now. When the collectors, the drivers, accept, each of their devices generates a NuCypher sharing policy, which is architected to enable NuCypher nodes to efficiently update the permissions associated with any data that they produce in the future. The sharing policies have a few key inputs: the collector private key, the acquirer's public key, the maps application's public key, a directory where the data goes, like a location or label, and the conditions of sharing. So only share data if the maps application pays. Okay, at the same time, a unique set of re-encryption keys are generated, just like in the animation. And this is for the NuCypher network to enforce the sharing policy, for them to actually, to make sure that it happens. And these keys go to the NuCypher network and they're held onto by the proxies, the nodes. Okay, cool. So now we have the sharing policies. The drivers, the collectors, they go and drive around and create some data. And the nodes, the proxies just wait and hold on to the keys. Okay, so as we established, the maps application needs access to fresh, regular data, every 5 minutes or 10 minutes or something. So the first step for the maps application to retrieve this data is for them to check if there has been any new data from some collectors. If there is new data, the next thing that the maps server does is it makes a payment to the collector's wallet. So it's paying the owners of the policies where there's new data. And then it says to the NuCypher network, hey, I paid them. Can I have the data, please? What the NuCypher network does, or the proxies do, is they check that the sums have been transferred into the wallets. This is all done on blockchain, so it's very easy for them to verify. Okay, the payment has gone through. I'm okay to send the new data to the maps application. Okay, so now what happens is the data is encrypted to create this ciphertext. This ciphertext is specifically for the sharing policy. So right here, this is Enrico. This is like the equivalent of the heartbeat monitor. So you have the data the new data is encrypted with the public key of the sharing policy, exactly like we saw in the demo. And then we end up with these special ciphertexts. And now this is like the important re-encryption step. So the NuCypher network, the proxies, they update the permissions associated with each of these ciphertexts, one for every set of new collector data. And they do this, as we saw, by operating on the ciphertext with the re-encryption keys that they are holding onto, transforming it into a form decryptable by the maps application. Nice. Now these ciphertexts are made for the maps application. So they're delivered to them and they decrypt them with their private key. And then they use the result of that decryption to access the new real world data. And then they put it into, the actual app. Okay, I hope this makes sense, but that's pretty much the flow. And really important, we've managed to achieve all of our initial objectives. Okay, what were they again? Let's go back and remind ourselves. Privacy, availability, and licensing. Okay, how do we achieve all of those? Well, no entity other than the maps application is ever trusted with the data from the drivers. It went from the driver to the maps application end-to-end encrypted. It was never decrypted by anyone else. So the drivers don't have to worry about their privacy, where are they going all the time, ending up on a Amazon database or something. Cool. Next, availability. So as soon as the Maps application needed the new data, they could get it as long as they paid, right? So it doesn't matter if the driver has gone offline or broken their phone or something. If they created some data, it will be shared with the Maps application when the Maps application needs it. So to maximize the data utility. And finally, the licensing. We made sure that the drivers were paid. So until they verifiably transferred funds to each driver, they did not get the data, which means they're incentivized to keep paying. And obviously, as we discussed, Maps data is very perishable. Next day it's not useful. So it's very, they have a big incentive to make sure they keep paying and they don't just buy it and then stop paying the collectors, the drivers. Okay, sorry, that was really long and probably tiring, but somebody asked about a real world use case, so that's a really good one. It's kind of an exciting framework because it's not just useful for self-driving cars and autonomous vehicles and collecting that kind of data. You could kind of use this for any sort of crowdsourcing. So for example, imagine you were trying to crowdsource news from a bunch of journalists. You kind of have the same requirements, you want to make sure that the journalists are protected, their privacy is protected. You want to make sure that you can get the data as soon as you need it. If you're building a story, let's say you're a news outlet and you have journalists out there in the field, and you want to make sure the journalists are paid. So there's another exactly the same requirements for a different use case. And again, all very relevant for NuCypher. I won't go into detail here because I'm getting sick of my own voice. I'm sure you guys are, but just a few more generic NuCypher use cases. Data sharing in self-sovereign systems. This means where the application or the decentralized application, the main reason for using it is because you want to be sure that you have control over the data that's on there. So a good example of that is like health data, genomic data. I personally will not get my DNA sequenced. I will not do a genomic like swab until there's a self-sovereign system that guarantees that no one else has access to it, outside of my control. Group communication, this is like Telegram or Signal. So like many-to-many communication or messaging is very relevant for NuCypher. And content distribution is kind of similar to, has similar requirements to the use case I just went through. Just before I end this part of the talk, I want to emphasize that this isn't all theoretical because we have many partners who are integrating us into their applications. And both on the user-facing side, so decentralized application, like Data.eum, which is the partner which is doing the crowdsourcing, and on the protocol and infrastructure side. So for example, we have decentralized databases like Bluezell, Fluence, and Walk, and they're using us to effectively enforce who has read permissions for a given database. And then also in the protocol side, Swipe and Datum, they are marketplaces where users can monetize their personal data, like their browsing history and other things. But then also on the user-facing side, we have many medical and biotech companies that are on that self-sovereign use case where they the users of the system can be very comfortable knowing that no one is going to access their data besides them. And also we have a few genomics, decentralized genomics platforms as well. Cool. That's probably the longest answer to a single question in history. So I'll stop now and hear some more questions.
インクリプションのところのユースケース、社会的に実用例があるのかっていう回答に対して、今、例えば、この、マッピングのところですね、マッピングの情報を提供というかシェアしたりっていうところで使えたりだとか、あとグループコミュニケーションや、あとコンテンツを実際にネット上で配信したりするっていう際に使えるんじゃないかなっていう説明がありました。はい。Are you still into your mind?
I'm still here.
Oh yeah. So there's some questions. So when Alice sent Bob to the data, Alice it means that Alice knows the public key of Bob, right?
The public key, yes.
Yeah.
Although we are working on a way to upgrade NuCypher to re-encrypt for anyone if they fulfill some condition. So right now, you have to know the recipients in advance, but it would be even more powerful if you could ask the proxies, hey, I don't care who the recipient is as long as they pay me. And it's possible to do this, but it's probably like a version 2 or version 3 of NuCypher.
So it means that you guys still studying how to do.
Yes, but I think we believe it's possible.
今の、例えばアリスからボブにデータを共有する際に、前提として、アリスがボブのパブリックキー、公開を知っていなければいけないか。あと、例えばシャーリーとか違う不特定多数の人がデータ、共有される際にパブリックキーを知らないといけないのかっていうことに対しては、現状、おっしゃるように、受け取り手のパブリックキーを知っている必要がある。つまり、もう特定の人に送るっていうことが前提としてあるらしいんですけれども、でもアップデートというか、やはり不特定多数の人に自由にシェアできるような形、仕組みっていうものができると思うので、今、どういうふうにやるかっていうのは研究中っていうことらしいです。So, the encryption itself has long history. It's been experimented for a few years, like decades ago, right? As I said, what is the most popular or most supported project in the with the encryption? Do you know any use cases?
It's NuCypher. I think operationalizing proxy encryption, I do think that we're probably leading that in terms of a commercial project, that's putting it into practice with real data. I'm probably not the right person to answer this because the history of re-encryption is better understood by our cryptographer who comes from an academic background. But that's kind of, I think that the vast majority of proxy re-encryption work has been done in an academic context. And so we're recently seeing more companies take on, recognize the value of proxy re-encryption, but we were first, and they're kind of, I think they're following after us. Is my view, my biased view.
まず、NuCypher がやっぱコマーシャル向けとか商業向けの、その D エンクリプションのところでは一番牽引してるんじゃないかなっていう、自分でもバイアスがかかってるんじゃないかっていうふうに言っていたんですけど、次回ですね、来週26日にその、違う講師、NuCypher のチームからジョンっていう人が、来週講師として参加してもらえるんですけど、その人が、その暗号化というか、エンクリプションの専門的な立場にいる人なので、ちょっとその人の方が詳しいんじゃないかなって、すみません、ちょっと詳しくないみたいな、そのことについては。
Is it worth talking about the task?
Can you wait a minute? We got some questions.
Sure, yeah.
So in regard with the encryption key, does that mean how can we make it? Do we only need Alice private key and both public key? How do we actually generate
Yeah, that's correct. It's constructed from Alice's private key and Bob's public key locally to Alice. So it doesn't leave this process doesn't transfer her private key anywhere, which is really important because some key management systems do that, which makes them follow a trust model. In terms of the actual way it's constructed, it uses an ephemeral key process and a few tricks like that to reduce the ability of reverse engineering the key. In terms of the actual sort of security threat, as far as I know, as far as I'm aware, the only way that you can reconstruct or get to Alice's private key is if Bob and all of the proxies that are involved, so let's say there's 20 proxies that are re-encrypting, if all 20 proxies and Bob get together, I think it is possible to reverse engineer Alice's private key. That is the only attack surface I'm aware of, which is extremely difficult to do if they are, you don't know who the Ursulas are. Bob doesn't have a very big motivation to do this because he's already receiving the data. But yeah, I have to say that as a disclaimer. Other than that, the re-encryption key is very, very secure.
D エンクリプションキーをどうやって生成するかという話で、最初のご理解であっているように、アリスの、プライベートキーとボブのパブリックキーが必要だというふうに。で、確かに、その点からして、懸念点みたいなものがあって、例えばリバースエンジニアリングでアリスのプライベートキーっていうものが、分かってしまうんじゃないかっていう懸念があるんですけども、例えばそのプロキシですね、が20あるだったときに、ボブのパブリックキーと20すべてのプロキシの情報をすべて揃えないと、アリスのプライベートキーっていうのは分かんないんじゃないかっていうふうに理論的に言っていて、要するにすごい難しいっていうふうに言ってるんで、言っています。はい。大丈夫ですかね、今の。はい。E エンクリプションが So one of the participants want to see the GitHub or like code of two things. One is the process of generating the encryption key, and one another is when encrypting the data from ciphertexts. Is that possible to provide those kinds of code or like a GitHub?
Yeah, absolutely. Everything is open source. So you can see the exact code where a cfrag, which is a fragment of ciphertext, is created, and everything else. The other thing you mentioned too, the generation.
You actually it to this website or the link?
Yeah, sure. I will. If you go to github.com/NuCypher/NuCypher, so twice, that's the primary library for the NuCypher network and the characters and sharing policies. So Alice and Enrico and Bob, and they have powers. Alice can grant. Bob can request, and this is all in GitHub, NuCypher, and NuCypher. If someone has a specific question about a specific action, they can maybe send me a message, and I can try and direct them to the exact file that has that particular step in it.
Thank you. GitHub でNuCypher 出していただけると、このテーブルはすべてライブラリ公開されているっていうことですので、そちらをご参照いただければ。Yeah, so can you proceed the presentation? Are you going to talk about the task?
Just quickly, I think honestly, everyone should read the task in their own time. It won't help that much me talking about it, but I'll just quickly introduce it. So obviously there's another presentation 1 week from today. I will join that presentation, but I won't give the presentation. My colleague will. And so in between, all of these resources are online and open source, so you can go and look at as much as code as you want. This task that I guess is shared with everybody is really about thinking about the NuCypher use cases and the demo, and thinking about modifying the demo for a new use case. So the steps are, I think it should be done in teams. I won't try to dictate the size of the teams. I think Show and Little Monty can work that out. In teams, you can go and look at the demo library from the demo I just presented and try to run a local node on your machine, use the web application, and then go through the workflow of generating a policy, sharing data, encrypting the data such that it can be shared. And then when you're comfortable with that and you understand roughly how that works, it'd be awesome if as a group you can come up with some new ideas for NuCypher. You can also, I've attached some links for some use cases that you can read to inspire you. So for example, the crowdsourcing one I explained. We have another one which is with another partner, which is like a decentralized Airbnb. And then there's a discussion about how NuCypher would work for a group chat, which is very detailed. It's in a forum with Status, which is you might know is a big blockchain project. And then, for each of these use cases that you brainstorm, I would like to see some value propositions. Why would a user care about this? It could be because it's very performant or because it protects their privacy, but try to be detailed there. Any problems of using it? and maybe like also reasons why it's better to use NuCypher than to use Amazon KMS or some other traditional system. And then choose one of those use cases and think about how we could adapt the demo to the use case, just at a high level. So like what needs to be changed. And then if you're feeling ambitious, can you start with the heartbeat demo, kind of like maybe fork it to your GitHub, and then make some modifications to the heartbeat demo to showcase the new use case that you came up with. Does anyone have any questions about the task? Next week we'll spend 30 minutes or something, and people can perhaps explain what they did. If there is a if like a lot of people want to submit code, then I can set up a dev post for you to submit that code to, and you know, like the sort of project. I can set that up like tomorrow.
そうですね、ワークショップっていうことだったので、タスクみたいなことをちょっとアーシャンに考えていただいていて、でちょっとその詳細っていうものをスラックに投げさせてもらったので、ちょっと確認していただければと思います。で、来週はまあ、アーシャンじゃない違うジョーンっていう人が、講師としてくるんですけど、まあ、前半30分とか、もしよろしければこういうことに組んでいただいて、シェアとかしていただければと思います。Do you have any things you have to explain?
I think if everybody is happy with these steps for the task, then I'm fine on my side. I just wanted to say, like, maybe after you guys have discussed it, you can just message me and say, okay, this is what people want to do. You know, people feel like they can try to write some code, you know, for step 6. Then I will, as I said, I can set up a way for them to submit that code so that we can maybe look at it, you know, next week and before Saturday, and we can, does that make sense? So maybe if people want to write code, then they can submit that to us. Then maybe on Thursday next week, John and I can look through the submissions, and then we can talk about them at the next Saturday.
もしそうですね、提案というか、まあ、コードでこういうものがいいんじゃないかっていうものがあったら、まあ、スタックにもアーシャンいますので、ダイレクトメッセージを送っていただいてもいいですし、普通にジェネラルで共有していただいてもいいですし、っていう形で、またそれを、来週中に彼らがチームで確認して、まあ、フィードバックというか、土曜日に、フィードバックですね、っていうものをさせていただければっていうふうに出ます。
Awesome.
質問とかってございますか？
春に、別のプレゼンテーションのために日本に来るときは、多分質問に日本語で答えみます。答えられるようにこれから練習します。頑張ります。
ありがとうございます。
簡単にしてください。
そうですね、4月とかまた春頃ですね、彼らを現地、まあ、今回そのウェブナーっていうちょっと僕たちも初めての取り組みでやらせていただいて、バタバタしてしまったんですけど、春頃には彼らが、日本にまた来た際に直接彼らに質問とかを、できるような場所というか機会というかをまた提供させていただければなと思います。はい。So, I guess we have to wrap up. So maybe if you have any comment or feedback. Oh, yeah. Can you show your face? We would like to take a picture.
Okay, sure. Let me join again with my phone. Give me a second.
最後、皆さん写真とか写りたくない方とかいらっしゃいますかね。なんかまた、じゃあ写してみんな写真撮るのかなっていうけど。そうですね、ちょっと僕たちウェブサイトやってるんで、そちらの方で掲載とかしてしまうんで、もしそういうのをちょっと、やだよっていう人いたら、全然、ありがとうございます。
ちょっと待って、これてください。
そう。
Try to show my NuCypher t-shirt.
ちょっと写真写ってもいいよって方いらっしゃるから、前の方とか見ていただいて、お写真撮ってもらう。よかった、はい、探してください。じゃあ、この辺に座ってもらっていいですか。お願いします。Can you see us? Our side?
Right now I'm just seeing the floor. Oh, I can see you now.
Please look at the screen.
Okay.
Yeah, like that. Yeah.
I'm not sure if I should look at my screen or the phone.
That one. One more picture. Thank you, Alison.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Have any comments?
No, it was great. I hope it was full and enjoyable.
Yeah, thank you. So, if someone has a comment, we will ask them to left the comments on the Slack. So please review it. Please review the Slack.
Perfect. I will check in there tomorrow, and maybe you can let me know how the group is approaching the task, and then we can decide what to do.
Yeah, got it. So are we seeing you next week? Or only John?
No, I will join too, but I won't present.
Okay.
I will certainly comment on any outcomes from the task, but he will present something more technical. This was more product related.
最初の参加するっていうことはね、プレゼンはしないんですけど、ジョーっていう、もうちょい技術寄りの方ですね、っていう方が参加するので、まあ今日も質問がいっぱいあって、疑問点がまだまだあると思うので、そういうところは来週会議していただければなと思います。じゃあ最後、ちょっとあなたに手振って終わろうと思います。Bye, Arjun. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Thanks for coming. Bye.
はい、ということでありがとうございました。今何時ですかね。12時13分。ちょっとオーバーしたからですけど、会場自体は1時まで使えるので、まあ、この後、せっかくこんなね、休日に集まっていただいたモチベーション高い皆さんだと思いますんで、まあ、懇親会みたいなものをちょっとやっていただければなっていうふうに思います。はい。すみません、ちょっと初めておウェブなんていう取り組みだったんで、バタバタしてしまってご迷惑おかけしたんですけど、いろいろ勉強になっていれば幸いです。最後にちょっとまた紹介したい人がいますので、ちょっとお時間いただければなと思います。